We're in Burlington, Vermont, talking with Murray Bookchin. And Murray, you're in your 73rd year, and you've been a revolutionary since the 1930s. You were talking earlier about handing out pamphlets in the streets during the labor movement. You were in Spain in the 60s doing research on the Spanish anarchist movement.
In the 60s.
In the 60s, yes. Could you share with us some of your background, how you became involved in revolutionary activities?
Well, I'd say that my revolutionary experience, if I can use that, goes back practically to Russia before the Bolshevik Revolution. In fact, even before the 1905 revolution in Russia. I can't say how long my family was living in southern Russia. It may have been every bit of 500 to 1,000 years, I don't know. But I was very greatly influenced, quite obviously, by my grandparents, and particularly by my grandmother, who was born around 1860, way back in what is today called Moldavia, but in her day was called Bessarabia. It was under Tsarist control. And they lived on the border of Romania, or possibly Austro-Hungary, it was called, Austria-Hungary. And in those days, back in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, into the 1890s, they had a movement called the Narodniki, which meant the populace. They're most famous, for example, for having executed Alexander II. They were called the People's Will, Narodnaya Volya. And my grandmother, however far removed she was from the center of Russia, possibly about 1,500 miles away from Moscow, or what was then later on to be called Petrograd, St. Petersburg, and Leningrad, be another 2,000 miles, nonetheless belonged to that whole movement of the Jews emancipating themselves from tradition, the Jewish Enlightenment it was called, or the Haskalah. And both she and my grandfather, whom I never knew, were Russian socialists, populist socialists, sort of on the anarchistic side. And they migrated, both my grandmother, after my grandfather died, and my mother and her brother, my uncle, to the Lower East Side, where they became more involved in the Russian labor movement, emigrant labor movement, than in the Yiddish or Jewish traditions of the Lower East Side. And they belonged to Russian workers' clubs, choruses. There was a very rich life that unfortunately we no longer know in our own time today in the 1990s. They didn't have telephones, they didn't have typewriters, they didn't have radios, and they didn't have television sets. So people continually mingled with each other. There was a very rich street life, and there was a very rich radical choral groups. There were very rich, very attractive lectures being given. Emma Goldman would come around, Eugene V. Debs would come around, Big Bill Haywood of the IWW would come around and continually lecture, as well as less luminous figures in those days. And in a great sense, in a very real sense, I guess they were part of the Russian workers' movement. And when, of course, the Russian Bolsheviks took over under Lenin and Trotsky, everybody became a Bolshevik. It didn't make any difference whether you were a Marxist or an anarchist or a social democrat, you know, if you were enthusiastic about the overthrow of the Tsar and the Red Flag and the Internationale, which became the official anthem of the newly emerging Soviet Union, you became a Bolshevik. You didn't have to read too much about it to know which side you were on. So when I was born, at the very beginning of 1921, and while the revolution, in effect, was still going on to some extent, I was completely suffused in this whole atmosphere of revolutionary dreams, very revolutionary visions, people talking enthusiastically about what was happening in the world, because it seemed like the world was going to transform itself completely. And I felt that energy, which remained with me well through the 1920s. In fact, the very first language, even though I was born in the United States, that I could speak with any fluency was Russian, which I've totally forgotten by and large. And the heroes and heroines that I saw all around me were pictures of Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht in the German Revolution, heroic figures from the Russian Revolution and the Russian revolutionary past. In fact, before I even knew the name of Robin Hood, I heard of Stenka Razin, who rose up in the 1600s against Tsarism, the Russian Cossack who led great masses of people against Tsarism, and then still later, a century or so, Emelian Pugachev's great uprising. And so I had a better picture of revolutions in Russia than I did of anything in the United States, which ultimately, of course, so far as the United States is concerned, I gradually assimilated as I went to school and began to mingle with also first-generation Americans, generally in a Jewish, socialist, or communist neighborhood of New York. New York at that time was made up of 1,000 villages. My parents, in point of fact, both father and mother, were proletarians in the real sense of the word. They worked in the garment district at a time when the unions were being organized. And they were also members of the industrial workers of the world when it was still the industrial workers of the world and not a mere remnant or a shadow of what exists today under that name. And now, is in San Francisco instead of being in Chicago, which is where it originally was located. And so quite naturally, I assimilated a good many revolutionary notions, becoming an atheist at the age of 6, a vegetarian between 6 and 14. These ideals were very ubiquitous they were present all over the place. Listened continually and learned stories and accounts about the Russian Revolution by people who fought in it, not just people who read about it in newspapers or in books. And by the age of 9 or so, I was actually recruited. 1930, no later than 1931, I was actually recruited in the children's organization of the Communist Party, the Young Pioneers of America, and went through that in one of the most hectic periods of American communism. That period was one of continual insurgency. The Communist Party and the Communist International, despite the fact that Stalin was coming to power, and his power wasn't absolutely assured as yet, was not to be assured until 5 or 6 years later, with the Moscow trials when they killed off all the old Bolsheviks. But before that period, between, say, 1930 or 31 and 1935, the United States, the Communist Party and the Communist movement generally in the United States was in its most insurrectionary phase. We'd go from one demonstration to another demonstration and fight the police in New York City. And with the Depression, we had great hunger marches. Thousands would rally in various parts of New York and march towards City Hall, New York City Hall, with bread banners and slogans like, "We want bread, not war," or "We want butter, not guns." Slogans that you could have heard in 1848 or in 1789 in the French Revolution. In other words, it was easier for us in those days to communicate more comfortably with someone who had been on the June barricade